We actually, when this first sort of came to light, shortly after he publicly attacked me as a racist and bigot and Islamophobe, and told me that I was no longer permitted to be in his Wednesday meetings, which is an eminently understandable thing, because I was perhaps the only person in that room who really understood what he was doing in those meetings, and for that matter continues to do today. I published a long piece in Front Page Magazine at David Horowitz's invitation that laid a lot of this out. And subsequently, Hugh Hewitt and Lars Larson, as I recall, two talk show hosts that we both have appeared on a lot of times, invited us to talk on the same program at the same time. That's the closest we've had to a debate. And I would characterize his response, though you can see it for yourself in the course, as basically an ad hominem attack on me of the kind I just described. A denial categorically that there's anything to any of this. And with the help of others in this movement and, you know, outside of it, who are admirers of his, I think, to basically shoot the messenger. So there has not been a proper debate. I would welcome one. Mohammed Majid is on the Countering Violent Extremism Working Group of the Department of Homeland Security, one of the arms of this Homeland Security Advisory Council that has been responsible of late for developing training standards, guidelines, for not only the Homeland Security Department, but for the entire United States government. I mentioned Thomas Perez in connection with the fact that reportedly in an event held in George Washington University Law School in October of last year, he was so moved by his affection for this gentleman that he jumped up on the stage and embraced him. What their associations are beyond that, I don't know. But I will tell you, if you take the time to look at the course, and I'm reasonably sure you will find in parts 8 and 9 a wealth of information about the extent to which Mohammed Majid is inside the wire from the Oval Office to the Department of Homeland Security's Countering Violent Extremism Working Group. It's extensive. It is, well, just to give you one example, and this is, again, kind of the incredible providential quality of a lot of this. And I should say, I guess, part of why I say there's anecdotal personal information disseminated throughout this is because I actually was co-located for 7 years in shared office space with Americans for Tax Reform. I mean, we shared a Xerox room, we shared a conference room, we shared hallways and elevators and bathrooms. The rest of it was separate. But shortly after we moved in, one of my colleagues came to me and said, "Do you know there's a Muslim Brotherhood front on the other side of that Xerox room?" Which I didn't know at the time, but in the course of the succeeding 7 years, I can tell you I confirmed to my satisfaction, and hopefully to yours if you see the data. But just to sort of close this point, one of the other providential things that occurred recently was I happened to be in Florida at a conference that was attended by a state senator from South Dakota by the name of Dan Lederman, I think it is. And we were talking about this, and he shared with me that an amazing thing had happened to him. He was in Minnesota attending a conference with a number of people, including Mohammed Majid. And it turned out he and Majid and Keith Ellison, who was also, I guess, participating in a congressman, first Muslim congressman from Minnesota, were driving from point A to point B, and Majid got some kind of urgent message, and I honestly don't remember whether it was by cell or by email or by text, but in any event, the president wanted to see him that night, which happened to be the night before the president's second Muslim outreach speech. Remember, the first one was in Cairo in 2009. This was in last year at the State Department. That was, you'll remember, The speech that the president used to preempt Bibi Netanyahu was then inbound, and to lay down the marker that the United States government's position was that Israel had to withdraw to the indefensible 1967 boundaries. I'm reasonably sure that that was vetted with Mohammed Majid. Maybe it was even his idea. I don't know. But it's one of those things that speaks to how directly the Muslim Brotherhood's senior operatives have penetrated the government of the United States to the point where they are inside the wire and I think affecting our security and policy. No, I couldn't agree with you more, and I really welcome that comment, Nolan, because part of what's really missing here, frankly, is that kind of corporate memory. We've been here before. In fact, we've got a slide, I think, in the briefing, certainly that I've briefed elsewhere, of President Reagan, then nothing more than the president of the Screen Actors Guild, testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee, telling people in that committee about a threat of considerable significance inside his circle of influence, his personal friends in some cases. And I think it's fair to say that his career was destroyed in Hollywood because he came forward and named their names and worked to try to root them out from the trade union association he ran at the time, but also from the industry where they had burrowed in for the purpose of destroying us from within. And, you know, I take it as my model. I appreciate that I'm not probably earning any friends, certainly within the conservative movement leadership, by saying the unsayable about other people who are considered to be among that group. But it must be done, just as it had to be done in the time you're talking about. And part 10 of the course, and I'm not quite sure from what you've said exactly who was organizing this effort, but part 10 of the course is about what we do about it. And we have got, as a nation, to do the kinds of things that were done when we faced a similar kind of totalitarian ideological threat in the past. The Foreign Agent Registration Act is still on the books. In fact, we believe and have been documenting for some time that the Council on American Islamic Relations, for one, is an unregistered foreign agent. And we've had a campaign, which Adam Savitt has been helping us with for some time, of notifying people who have been subjected to influence operations by these folks at CARE, warning them that this is an unregistered, seemingly unregistered foreign agent engaged in influence operations. So I think it's a pathetic backwater in the Justice Department at the moment. I think they've got one part-time woman who telecommutes that's responsible for it. With ancient, I suspect your files were better than hers, and certainly your technology was probably better than hers. There are indeed a very few, Muslim groups in this country and one at least in Canada that I would consider to be authentically on our side, opposed to Sharia as a political doctrine. And I think it, again, we make this point repeatedly in the program, it behooves us to be empowering those folks, working with them, legitimating them, helping them become more visible. One of them is run by a friend of ours by the name of Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi got a lot of attention when he was called before the House Homeland Security Committee last year by Pete King to testify about radicalization inside his community. And he told me afterwards something that really, was heartening. Despite the fact that CARE, rained all kinds of hurt on both Congressman King and him in particular, he said that, I talked with him for our radio show 4 days or so afterwards, and he said, I've had thousands of Muslims contact me and say, thank you for saying what you said. Somebody finally is speaking for me. I'm otherwise completely unrepresented by the Muslim leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood. He has not only got the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, his own organization, but he's helped forge a coalition that in principle, could become a real counterweight to the umbrella group that the Brotherhood set up, the Islamic Society of North America. He calls it the American Islamic Leadership Coalition. And I think these guys are people who you can distinguish from the other in part because they make very clear they don't want any part of bringing Sharia to this country. The other dead giveaway is that they are ruinously attacked by the Muslim Brothers. And I think, you know, if you find people who aren't being singled out and attacked by them, chances are they're at least willing to go along with the other program. I don't know about the Romney campaign. I know some people who are involved in it. I know them to be very good people, very serious people. But as with the Bush campaign, and I suspect the McCain campaign, there are certainly people, some of them are associated with Grover Norquist, I would imagine, and some of them may be coming to it through other means, who are coming to them. Governor Christie comes to mind, a very prominent figure in the Romney campaign, and unfortunately misleading them about the Muslim Brotherhood, about the threat that it represents, misconstruing it themselves repeatedly in the case of Governor Christie, and I suspect, you know, pushing that line inside the campaign. To his credit, I had the chance. Well, I hope that that will be something of a, you know, an inoculation against this. Daniel Pipes of the Middle East Forum and Stephen Emerson of the Investigative Project on Terrorism are two people that we've relied on for this course and in so many other ways. Tremendous assets, and they did something of a drill down on just how wrong Governor Christie has been on this and why I think that would absolutely preclude him from being a candidate for vice president. Let me emphasize that point because we lingered in the overview and we develop at length again in the course what I consider to be essentially the most important takeaway. And that is if you want to really get to the difference between the Muslim stand that you got to be worrying about and the Muslims you don't have to be worrying about, I think the fault line really is Sharia. It unfortunately happens to be the case that the guys who say that's Islam have the better argument. Steve Coughlin is one of the country's leading non-Muslim experts on the subject, and if you want more on that, he's got hours of material that he can share with you on it that makes the case, I think, beyond dispute. Muslims who don't know what Sharia is, or who don't practice it themselves, I mean, maybe in a strictly limited personal pietistic way, yes, but not in terms of an ideological doctrine. They're not interested, they don't feel called to jihad, are not the problem, at least not yet. And what worries me, which goes back to Dan's question so much, is if we don't get this, Mario, just as you say, if we don't get that what we're dealing with, I don't know who said this originally, but I'm not taking credit for it because somebody else was smart enough to coin the phrase, but the idea that we're confronting communism with a God, which is a lot more dangerous than communism without a God, especially in a country like this where we are practicing, to our grave peril, a form of tolerance towards what is really fundamentally about power and not about faith, a degree of passivity, or worse, an opportunity for them to actually translate it into real progress towards their political agenda. And so I couldn't agree with you more that this is in a class by itself. The one thing we might quibble about, Mario, is whether it's right or certainly strategically useful to describe the problem as Islam. And the reason that and let me just say, I've learned most of what I know about this subject from the co-authors of this book. And we've got Steve and Patrick and Admiral Lyons and Claire Lopez and Christine Brim and Hank Cooper, and am I missing anybody else? I mean, some of the best people I know, many of whom really have gone to school on this, who've taught me about that distinction, and I would urge everyone here to make it. Probably the most important part of the course, if I had to reduce it to one segment, as titillating as the personalities and what's happening, the implications for policy and so on. But I think the thing that everybody really needs to study up on is part 2 of the course, which talks about how the civilization jihad is actually working inside America. And this conversation is a prime example of one of the most insidious pieces of it. It's the interfaith piece. It's not just the Catholics by any means. It's rabbis. It's ecumenical, big time evangelicals, other faiths. Anyway, the reason I mention it is because one of the really important things to know that I don't think any of the folks who are involved in this interfaith dialogue and bridge building and so on know is that the most influential, arguably the most influential ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood is a fellow by the name of Sayyid Qutb of Milestones fame. Required reading, if you really want to know what this, this book, by the way, which we have copies of for you if you'd like it, take a look at the annex. It's the second appendix, because it's that Muslim Brotherhood strategic plan in its entirety, including the list of the 29 organizations. But second only to that, I guess I would say required reading is Milestones. And one of the points that he makes in Milestones, and Steve will correct me if I don't get this exactly right, is that the chasm between the Muslim, the believer, and the infidel is so vast that no bridge can be built to span it except for the purpose of bringing the unbeliever to Islam. In other words, it's a one-way bridge. It's about dawah. It's about proselytizing and recruiting and indoctrinating. And those who are opening their mosque, one of our co-leaders, General Jerry Boykin, extraordinary human being, tells these churches, where he spends a lot of time warning about what's being done to and with them by their own hands, that do you know that when you open your church to the overflow crowds as an act of, Christian charity or ecumenicalism or whatever, that the first thing they do as part of the service is to consecrate the facility to Islam, and that in the course of the prayers, they call for the death and destruction of Christians and Jews? He asks, rhetorically, how many of the congregants would think it's a good idea to be opening these facilities up? Well, they shouldn't, and they wouldn't, but they don't know, and the people that they're relying on, their clerical leaders, should also know. And I'm hoping that MuslimBrotherhoodinAmerica.com will be one of the things that is done. Well, there are people in this room who have at least as good relations with those guys as I do. I would certainly encourage them to do that. I don't, unfortunately, they lost, and therefore their stroke with him may not be what you would want it to be. On the other hand, he presumably needs their help. And so this is a moment when I just, this really is above partisanship as far as I'm concerned. As you see, this is an equal opportunity problem. And as a former Scoop Jackson Democrat myself, I can tell you, I'm sick to the heart that there are Democrats who are as deeply invested in helping this as there are. Some of whom Grover is working with and some of whom he's not. But the point is that Romney, when I think I started to say this, I had a chance to visit with him for a couple of hours thanks to Congressman Pete Hoekstra during the last cycle. And we had a lot of conversation about this problem. And he seems very much to get that we've got a problem with violent jihad. And interestingly enough, in the ad that they ran, the Obama team ran last week, in which they said he wouldn't have pulled the trigger on Osama bin Laden based on a quote from something he said in, I think, 2007. Well, interestingly enough, if you actually look at the entirety of the quote, I think this was in my column this week, but the entirety of the quote says it's not just bin Laden or just Al-Qaeda or just Al-Qaeda and its franchises. It's Hamas, it's Hezbollah, it's the Muslim Brotherhood. We need a comprehensive strategy for dealing with all of these threats. Well, if he gets that, still, that's a good thing. But it is more than just the violent jihad. As I say, that's kind of the core finding of this course is if we keep missing the nonviolent, or more accurately, pre-violent part of it, you know, we're going to continue letting these guys have open field while we chase over after those guys. I would just invite anybody who has access to the Romney campaign or otherwise has influence with any of the previous candidates to encourage this. For that matter, I'm hopeful that one of the things that's going to come out of all of this is that we're going to get some requests to inspectors general to look at what it means that you've got these kinds of Muslim brothers operating in or with these agencies. I'm hoping that we're going to get reviews by the committee chairmen who have jurisdiction. I mean, we've got 5 or 6 months now where this ought to be very much a focus because at the minimum, it's a political liability for the president. And I'm not saying do it because of that. I'm just saying if you don't do it for any of the other compelling reasons, that ought to be one. It's a great question, and it is really part 10 of the course that we talk about what do we do about this. I don't. Yeah, we got some very specific suggestions about what we do about it. The idea of holding people accountable for what has been done to this point is sort of a central proposition, Hank. And one of the places that we start is many of you, and you most especially, Mr. Ambassador, but I suspect looking around the table, most of us at one time or another have sworn an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. If we just ensure that people are actually living up to that oath, that would clean up a lot of this. They have, and I would just invite Steve Coughlin to say something about this because he is the guru on it. They have, quite apart from this oath of office, they have a professional duty to know this threat. I encourage you to look at parts 1 and 2 of this course because that's exactly where we start. We start with what the nature of the threat is. We define it, I think, in the ways that you're talking about defining it. We've been out a week. I hope you'll help us get it around. We've had something like 60,000 downloads on this thing in the space of that week. Go forth and multiply is all I can say.
I personally believe, and I'll let Rich jump on me for if he wants to add to it, I think people generally have no understanding of the scope of what's going on. They plan to completely win this war in the information battle space, and they're doing it. And I think that when you start to look at what we're looking at, Al-Qaeda, jihadist entities are just one of 4 parts of the takedown. There's the OIC, which represents the Ummah, and we have to understand that we go to the Prince Ali bin Talal Center, and we find at Georgetown, we find out the only people who get a PhD who then work for the government are approved by people who come from the Prince Ali bin Talal Center. Then we understand that maybe part of the problem is the people inside analyzing this problem are beholden to sources and authorities that are not this country. And so I would like to point out that in terms of scoping it, we need to step back and make a decision about whether we're going to understand it. And I think the point is, if you walk back the dog on Sharia, you're going to find out that there's a central point where the OIC, that's every one of our coalition partners, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Qaeda have a completely unified vision of where they're going. And it's not an accident that someone like Prince Ali bin Talal and other very affluent Middle Eastern people who are beholden to jurisdictions of the OIC end up becoming the second largest owners of every major media outlet in this country. Because you're asking, why isn't this out there? Because part of their success is they already achieved information dominance in this country. They already established what does and does not pass for news. Okay? This isn't they're on the leading edge of doing something in this country. They're in the near takedown phase of this country. On the information side, they're in execution mode, not construct the model on which to take people down. And all you have to do is bring this stuff up in public and find out you're just as likely to get fired under the Bush administration for talking about this factually as you are in the Obama administration. They plan to win the war through disinformation. And that's where we are, and they're going to win this war. I think they've already won it in the Middle East if we don't reverse engines.
Steve Coughlin is about to publish a book. I'm hoping I'm going to live long enough to see it, but it's coming, I know. that I hope will help further enrich this very, very important, understanding of the nature of the problem. I would just simply say, too, that when you're talking with regular people and you're equipping them with this kind of information, nature is going to take its course. It's a question of giving them the vector to go forward and try to do something about it. And Patrick, you've done as much, I think, to help popularize this as any of us, and I salute you for it. In the hopes of helping distill this down, we have, and Steve, if I can just have this gentleman's attention, we do have in the back a 1.5-page list of the findings, which are our effort to try to distill this. We've also got a longer bit of synopsis, which will help you if you can't get to the course. There are a lot of parallels. In fact, we refer to illegal immigration as one of the examples of places where the policy is very much helpful to the Islamists, and I think calculatedly so, to be honest with you. Let me just say one more thing about this, and then, Owen, I'll let you finish it up. When we started talking about Sharia 7, 8 years ago, I don't know, Steve, when we first met, it was probably 7 or 8 years ago now. I guarantee you that very few people in America knew what that meant. Still a lot of them who don't, but there are a lot more who do today. And I think, personally, that helping them understand who the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be made a lot easier, both by our efforts, but more to the point, by what the Muslim Brotherhood is going to do with the $1.5 billion in their taxpayer money that they've just got, and with their help in other ways in the Middle East and elsewhere. Steve may be right that the Middle East is already lost. I don't know. I suspect there's still one really horrible war before it's over there. But it's certainly the case that with a concerted effort by smart people who get the problem, using all of the skill sets we've got, including good marketing, I think we can help equip the American people to make informed decisions about what's happening to their country. And if we don't do it now, it's going to get a lot harder to do. But if we do it now, I think we've got a real window to shift the course of this battleship. Let me close with that really as kind of the crux of the matter. A fascinating anecdote, which I think is actually true. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. But when the Bolsheviks were seizing power in the what was then still the Russian Empire, there were so few of them. They didn't have enough to go round up all of the opposition elements simultaneously. They had to do it serially. And the point is, A, that small numbers of determined and ruthless people can accomplish things that would seem unimaginable. I would argue even in a country like ours. And secondly, if we essentially allow them to do it by our passivity or in the interest of political correctness or diversity or fear or whatever, we will enable, we certainly are emboldening, and I think this goes to Steve's point, what they're doing now in the Middle East is in part a function of what they sense they can get away with. And the trouble with it is, and perhaps especially for friends of mine who've served in uniform, perhaps the most distressing piece of this whole course is what we found as we looked at the United States military and how it is being affected by this submissiveness, this accommodationist approach, whether it's the rules of engagement, whether it's the coin strategy, whether it's the apologies, whether it's the gloves when they're handling the Quran, whether it's that bit about, whatever they hold sacred, we're going to hold sacred, on and on and on. And if it's allowed to continue, if we are actually going to enable them through information dominance or through whatever other technique to get to the point where they are confident that we're submitting, far from that being the end of it. That's where, under their doctrine, they are obliged to go violent, to finish the job, to, as the Quran says, make us feel subdued. So this is a moment when I think I'm just profoundly grateful to you all turning up and listening patiently and thoughtfully to what you've seen here. I hope you will take as an invitation, really from my heart, to go further drill down on this, if you would, with this course at MuslimBrotherhoodinAmerica.com. But more to the point, I hope you'll pass it on to the people that you care about and who care about you, and who will help further, I'm sure, translate the sorts of things that we've talked about here today, that we talk about in Part 10, and that we may not yet have come up with, but that good, smart people will when they realize what's at risk here, what's at stake, which is, I think, ensuring that our children and our children's children know firsthand what it is like to live in a United States that's free. So with that, thank you very much again for coming, and God bless you all.